I'll invite our panelists and moderators on the stage and invite everyone to stand up and stretch for a minute before we continue if you want to.
She would have been here even better.
All right.
Why not?
Short stretching time. All right, let's continue with our panel, and I'll let I think Christian Novak start by introducing some of the speakers. Thank you.
No, fantastic. Can you hear me well? Is this working or not? Hello. Oh. It's working now. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah. Hey, great. Listen, really excited about this panel. Let me go through the short bios. The longer versions are already posted in our website. Let me start with Tom. Tom Boy is the Director of Food Systems and Nutrition at Global Affairs Canada, with over 27 years of service to the Government of Canada. Tom has held diverse leadership roles, including Country Director for Vietnam, Indonesia, and Asian Development Programs at Global Affairs Canada, Director for International Financial Institutions at the Canadian International Development Agency, and Policy Director for Horizontal Policy and International Protection at Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Lisa Kurbiel leads the Joint SDG Fund and at the United Nations, managing over $490 million in capital, leveraging $19 for every dollar that has been committed, all this to accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in developing countries. A passionate human rights advocate, she has built lasting relationships with businesses, civil society, and philanthropies with a focus on the most vulnerable. With over 22 years of UN experience, including postings in Somalia, South Sudan, Mozambique, and Kenya, Lisa brings expertise in public policy, strategic communications, and innovative financing. And Andy Ouedraogo is a government engagement and civic space lead at Corporations Canada, where she works at the intersection of policy, sector transformation, and the future of international development. Her work focuses on strengthening the enabling environment for civil society while helping the sector navigate structural change with greater strategic clarity. She has led various initiatives, including the Global Corporation Futures Initiative, aimed at reimagining next generation global corporation in 2035. And this earlier experience includes multilateral work with the United Nations Environment Programme and the UN General Assembly. And as Jan introduced me before, I'm Christian Novak. I'm a professor of practice at the Institute for the Study of International Development. I'm also a managing partner at FMA, which is a consulting firm. And in both roles, I do play an important focus on the effective and efficient use of public and private capital for financing the Sustainable Development Goals. And I am delighted to co-moderate, together with Gabriela, this distinguished panel. So please, Gabriela, on to you.
Hi, my name is Gabriela. I'm a U3 Honors International Development Studies student here at McGill University. I also currently serve as Vice President of Events for the International Development Studies Student Association, or the IDSSA, where I help plan and organize speaker events and just student programming for the IDS community. And now that we have gone through all of the introductions, we're going to get started with the questions. The first one is for Tom. Climate adaptation is becoming a core development function, but adaptation projects can still reproduce inequality. What principles should guide future adaptation so it strengthens justice rather than displacement?
Of the questions that were provided, I found this one to be the most interesting. After having served 3 years on the board of the Green Climate Fund, as well as the Council of the Global Environment Facility, climate adaptation is real, and many Africans, leaders, people tell us that they live with it. Even my family who lives in Hue, Vietnam, feel it every day. And the people I visit in the Mekong Delta also feels it every day. So the real question is, how do we help those people who live it day to day without all of the, highfalutin words and supply-driven approaches? And the only way that it makes sense is if we involve them as partners. So there are safeguard policies at, say, the World Bank Group. There are things like UN DRIP. There are the policies and the requirements to actually not only consult, but make sure that people who are impacted by this are part of the solution. And I'll give you just a few examples. When I was on the Green Climate Fund board, whenever there are allegations of not involving people, indigenous peoples or civil society, and if their voices are not heard, the board doesn't like it. We make sure that the Secretariat hears our displeasure. The other thing that we also make absolutely sure is that it's not only about written consultation. There are actually active observers on the board. They're there, sitting, listening to us and everything else. And they have the right to voice on behalf of their constituency concerns on any project. The other thing that makes sure that we are not just talking a good talk is that every deliberation we have actually is open to the public in terms of YouTube and stuff like that. So active partnership, active contribution, as well as transparency ensures that we try to do things right for people and by people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful response and just by highlighting the importance of consulting the impacted communities. The next question is also for you. From your vantage point within Global Affairs Canada, how do shifting global alliances and geopolitical rivalries influence Canada's approach to international development and global security partnerships?
This is actually a good one, too. I'll take from my past as the former Director of Private Sector and Trade at CEDA. So when I entered CEDA in 2009, we have things people called head of aid. And the emphasis is the word aid. So it's like supply-driven, we know best, and stuff like that. A few years later, we had no choice but to change it to head of cooperation. So it's no longer one way. It's actually we cooperate. Given what Dr. Vera Songwei said, I would move the word cooperation one step further to partnership. So, for instance, when I was the director for Canada-Vietnam, I always call it Canada-Vietnam Development Partnership. I don't call it the Vietnam Development Program. It's as if we give it to them. One of the conversations I had with the Deputy Ambassador of Vietnam and also the Deputy Minister of Planning and Investment of Vietnam struck me immensely. They told us, we don't need your money. What's 10 million to a country with more than 10 million? And if they need to, Tokyo is going to give them like $1 billion. What they needed from us was actually a friend, a partner. If they need our help to, for example, share with them our food safety expertise, that was actually a direct ask, and we gave it to them. What if they wanted to modernize their government? So the party, the Communist Party, the Secretary General wanted to improve governance, but he didn't know who to ask. I just happen to know a little bit about the history of Canada-Vietnam, and when Vietnam entered APEC, there was one global leader who helped their leader with just a friendly chat of how to compose himself within APEC. And that leader was Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. And it was Jean Chrétien who actually gave 2 hours of his time to that Secretary General to just talk. And believe it or not, it's the sharing of whatever we have that they need, be it expertise in, say, startups. They came here to study our startups and to visit how we do Costco even, because they wanted to learn that. And there are so many other things. So the story, kind of like the lesson I took away from all of these episodes is, if you listen as a friend to what they need, and don't question it, just because when they ask you as a friend, it's something valuable. And if you have it, why don't you give it? If it doesn't cost money, some of the best things are actually doesn't cost any money, and you can't buy it anyways. So that's how we're pivoting, I guess, towards the new international development framework from aid to cooperation to partnership.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom, for answering for those questions. And I should also mention that all of the questions, or at least most of them, have been brought by the students, and Gabriela played a key role in gathering those. So thank you for your questions having been sent in advance. And it's the focus of the questions we're bringing here, which also makes, my job here a lot easier. But let me go now into asking Lisa. So Lisa, you lead the UN Joint SDG Fund at a time when development financing gaps are huge and widening. How do you see innovative financing mechanisms reshaping the future of multilateral development cooperation?
Yeah, thanks very much, Christian. Such an honor and a privilege to be here. Lovely to meet all of you. So that question is sort of 2 in 1, right? Because it begs the question about multilateralism at all, which is completely under threat. And I'm sure you're reading the papers more closely than I am, but being inside the UN every day demands nerves of steel. This is what the Secretary General tells staff to have. We have to stay focused on why we joined the United Nations and our belief system, because it's being rattled every day. And part of that is the economics of keeping a multilateral institution like the UN open, with the lights on and with paid staff who are committed to working and engaging in the very countries, the example that Tom gave, in Vietnam. There has to be, we hope, in the future, forever, a UN country team that can enable and support the carry-through on an example like that. So if Vietnam wants the Costco, wants the examples from Canada, hopefully there's that UN country team and the technical expertise that can help them implement that strategy when they're back home. So first and foremost is the multilateralism challenge that we're up against. Within that is this tiny piece of pooled funding, which is 3% of the development spend. Development spend is running right now at about $60 billion a year, used to be more. And within that is 3%, and within that 3% is a fund that I manage, which is running at about 500 million. We're trying to get up to 600 million. So it's very, very small, but it's meant to be catalytic. And the question is focused on the way I met Christian, which is around blended finance, which is something Canada does very well. Other member states are looking much more closely at, and it hints to what Dr. Songwe also said in her keynote, which is this evolution of, when the big trees aren't playing, when they're not leaning in, is there new spaces? And I, like her, agree that the private sector isn't really slowing down looking for its 8, 9, 12% returns, because that's what they need to give their shareholders every single day. So they're still going to be looking at emerging markets with all the risks involved, right? They're still going to be looking for a de-risking agent, which I happen to be, because I provide first loss for catalytic investments in a Zimbabwe, in an Uruguay, in a North Macedonia, to attract not only the development banks, but the private sector banks and the asset managers, and eventually maybe even your pension fund, maybe. And I think the message to me is blended finance offers more than grant money. So Tom was giving you that transition from calling it aid to talking to partnerships and cooperation. We don't even say aid anymore. We don't want to say grants. We want to say blended finance, which suggests that my money is being blended with others to go further. So that 1 to 19 that's in my bio, and I put everywhere I can, I'll put it on a sign outside if you'll let me, is because I want to show that every dollar that a precious government, like the government of Canada, might put into the UN doesn't equal a dollar on the ground. It equals much, much more. How do you do that? You have to look at innovative financing mechanisms. You have to look at SDG bonds. You have to look at renewable energy investment funds. You have to look at mechanisms that allow you to invest and earn a return so that there's more funding to do the vaccines, to do the education, to do the clinic revitalization, to train the government staff. And so that's, to me, something that I think is rising in the midst of what we're calling UN 80. The UN is that old that we have to reboot at 80 years old. But if we do have a role in the future of multilateralism and the future of sustainable development, how do we get there? And I do think innovative finance is going to be a piece. So that's a plug for how are you studying the areas you're interested in, and how are you going to help finance it? Because it's one thing to believe in human rights. It's another thing to have the deep pocket and the ability to help those communities finance themselves, whether they be the indigenous peoples, whether they be a vulnerable group of women, whether it be young people who don't get to ever be in a privileged situation like this. Look where we are. This is incredible. So how do we ever remember, and how do we facilitate the financing to them? Thanks, Christian.
No, thank you, Lisa. And a mobilization ratio of 19 is impressive and certainly exemplary. So that's a fantastic ratio to broadcast indeed. You know, I have another question for you, and of course we have more afterwards. You know, so the next one says you've led the UN Joint SDG Fund through overlapping crises. So here comes the question: how this period changed your view of what multilateral cooperation needs to look like to stay effective?
Yeah, great question. So I started this job in 2019, and the reason I got this amazing job is because my mentor and dear friend Jennifer in the back row told me to apply. So that's a plug for get yourself mentors and friends who can tell you about the right jobs. She's there at the classes. Don't forget to say hello. Amazing UN colleague. So the fund sort of started operations in 2019. I moved from Africa to New York to take this brand new job. And then COVID hit the world about 6 months later. So we were brand new. And it was very clear that the whole world had to worry about getting ventilators where they needed to be. Dr. Songwe talked about getting the vaccines where they need to be, right? I mean, the supply chains, as we all remember, right? Maybe you were all too young to remember, but it was dire. And as governments were trying to fast forward through this, the UN was trying to be relevant and useful. So we pivoted the money that was already programmed for perhaps a child grant in Vietnam or a social protection mechanism in a Dominican Republic were pivoted and launched towards what was needed. So I guess my number one takeaway is when there is a crisis, you have to be flexible, you have to be able to pivot. Even if you are institutional, you still have to find a way to get around it. So that was a COVID example. And then fast forward to sadly 4 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine. And as we're seeing now with the war in Iran, you know, it was food, fuel, and fertilizer prices just went through the roof, right? Because again, supply chains were devastated by that. So we developed a module that had actually come out of the COVID fund, which was called a development emergency modality. And that meant it wasn't a tsunami, right? It wasn't a conflict or a war that broke out that would cause humanitarian needs, but it was a development emergency, because if you can't have the fertilizer available now, you can't plant the crops, which means next year already, right? You're planning ahead for that seasonal agricultural yield that might, give you your GDP growth, but it also might just feed. It might be food security for your country, make that available. So that was a new modality that we had to develop, and frankly, my team and I are asking, will we need to invoke the development emergency modality again? Because we are seeing the fuel prices going. So when fuel prices go up, and in today's FT, they were talking about Thailand has fuel for 27 days, and other countries have fuel for 60 days. What happens when you run out of fuel? Your whole country slows, it grinds to a halt. And then we know that there's a chance of social unrest and worse, right? So that's something that I think is really important. And then I'll take us to the latest crisis, which is in fact the funding crisis that is literally front and center in front of any UN staff today, and we're calling it UN 80. That's the context in which we're trying to push a reform exercise to the Economic and Social Council that will meet this year in June. That's when the Secretary General will propose a reform process. And in my case, it's about showing my value and my efficiency at every step. So if I can shorten a process, if I can use AI, you all use it, right? So I'm sure you're using it, but you have to use it smartly, right? You can't just, we know better in university that we can't just use it without having a control over it. So how do we enable this? How do we expedite getting to the solutions on the ground? Of course, that means involving civil society and the communities, but how do we do that in the way that really can convince others to join what I'm trying to do, which is collective action and unity of force of a UN team on the ground? And I think that's really needs a lot of young minds. It needs a lot of brilliant ideas, because the challenges are going to grow and the envelope is going to shrink. That is the trend analysis on every chart you're seeing. Official development assistance is dying. It's in the intensive care unit, but investments continue. The private sector will still keep searching for where to put its solar panels, its hydrogen plants, its AI data centers. So how do we, the UN, enable and facilitate that? Thanks, Christian.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for those thoughtful responses. The next two questions are for Andy. The first one is, you've worked across multilateral institutions like the UN and frontline humanitarian organizations. How has moving between operational, multilateral, and policy spaces shaped your understanding of what makes international cooperation effective?
Thank you very much for the really good question. I second to your point, Tom. Those are excellent questions. So I would say that one of the biggest lessons I've actually learned in working in those three spaces is that the international cooperation system operates in very different logics depending on where in the system you sit in. And so I've had the chance to work at the UN, as was mentioned by Christian in my bio reading. And what I've been able to pick up on there is that the focus often is on norm setting and agenda coordination. So by norm setting, what I mean is that it's the mechanisms through which rules and the value of the system of cooperation are established or defined. And by agenda coordination, what I mean is really how there is an attempt to align. So how, what actors, for example, focus on which issues and invest in what particular priorities. So that would be, for example, high-level processes, meetings, diplomatic processes, interagency coordination. And so at that level, the focus again is on that norm setting. When you go to the operational level, and more specifically in the humanitarian settings, the sense of urgency makes it so that the focus is on the needs and the importance of responding to emergencies as they happen. So if you work, for example, at the operational level and you get to be, let's say, a frontline worker, you get to really see the complex local dynamics on the ground in countries. You get to see sometimes very difficult conversations and decisions being taken about prioritizing one crisis over another or one community over another. So it gets really real fast. And you also get to really appreciate the importance of building relationships partnerships and trust in those communities as well. And at the policy level, which I've been working in for the last 3-4 years, it's really about strategy. It's about accountability. And it's also about ensuring that the development priorities appear in political agendas. So that might look different, again, from depending on where you work, in what organization you work. But on my side of things, it's been about political advocacy with parliament members, government members like Tom on my left here. And in terms of what I believe in those 3 spaces might make cooperation more effective, I would say there are 3 things. One is context matters. And Tom alluded to partnerships earlier in his response to the answers, and he mentioned how it's important to ensure that local folks, local communities who are affected get to actually sit in those decision-making spaces, get to contribute to the planning, the implementation, the monitoring, the evaluations of projects, initiatives, programs. So it's really about understanding what drives the needs of that community and what do people think they need. Obviously, from a donor perspective, that might look different because you also have your own agenda, and it has to be. There are tensions at times, but emphasizing the importance of local partnership, locally led development, locally derived development is key. The second thing is going to be trust. I think trust is oftentimes underestimated, and I believe it's the invisible infrastructure that really makes or breaks global cooperation initiatives. Without that trust, it's really impossible to achieve much. And so that would be my second factor for effective cooperation. My third, and perhaps equally important factor, is going to be alignment. So alignment between different actors, alignment between different sectors, within sectors, and most importantly, alignment between the global commitments, the global frameworks, and the operational incentives. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we have super ambitious goals, like the SDGs are amazing, Lisa, and we're all trying to achieve them by 2030, which we're running out of time and out of funding and money. But they're important, but at the same time, ensuring that we have the resources, the means, the systems in place to be able to reach those goals is equally important. And I will speak specifically about funding. So the funding frameworks that we have, oftentimes, they prioritize short-term results over long-term sustainable action. So I think funding frameworks, project requirements, reporting requirements, as well as I think it was the risk tolerance issue. There is, in the CSO world, we often mention how risk-adverse governments and donors are, and Lisa also mentioned this in her answers. And so I think that creating environments and systems and incentives that enable us to actually achieve those ambitious goals will be important. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you so much. I particularly found the part about the 3 points about what makes cooperation effective very insightful. And the next question is also for you. Canada often positions itself as a champion of human rights and feminist international assistance. Where do you see the biggest gap between commitment and implementation?
Again, excellent question. Before I actually answer, how many of you believe that Canada is a champion of human rights and feminist international policies? Feminism? One hand only? What makes you not think so? I'm curious to hear after during the reception. But my answer to that question might actually surprise a lot of you. I think that Canada has done a lot when it comes to human rights and feminist leadership. Obviously, the FIAP, which is the Feminist International Assistance Policy, was created in 2017, and ever since then, it's really transformed the way that development policy is thought about in Canada, within CSO circles, within implementers and donors, and even globally as well. And I think that we see, I believe as of 2024, 95% of Canada's bilateral ODA actually had a gender gender equality component to it. So there's significant advancement in that sense. In terms of human rights, I can also name a number of initiatives that Canada has taken on the global stage and also at home here to ensure that human rights defenders, for example, are protected. You have the Voices at Risk guidelines that are basically a toolkit for Canadian missions abroad to be able to protect and authorize human rights defenders in those countries to seek help and refuge in times of crisis. That's one big commitment it's made. There's also the Global Media Fund that I think is funded at about $3 million, which is significant for protecting media globally. You also have a number of spaces in which Canada is very much involved. One of that is the Communities of Democracies, and they actually used to chair the working group on enabling CSO, so it's the CSO environment between 2009 and 2024. And you also we also mentioned, for example, the OECD DAC. Reference group that is co-chaired by Canada. So there's been a number of spaces in which Canada has been very vocal, very took a stand, didn't take a step back like our neighbor in the south. Pun intended, sorry. But I would say that all in all, there are really good normative frameworks and ambitious goals. At the same time, and hear me out, at the same time, I'm going to be really careful here with Tom on my left, but at the same time, there are challenges when it comes to the implementation of those policies and frameworks. And I will focus specifically on the FIAP. The FIAP, as I mentioned, is great in terms of its value and the impact it has on the development sector. I think when it comes to challenges, I would name maybe 3 of them. The first one is policy coherence. The second one is conceptual clarity. And the third one is implementation gaps. I think Tom agrees, it seems. And so at the policy coherence level, we have a number of incoherences that we can name, but mainly when you have a policy that is built on centering human rights, on centering equity, on centering gender equality, and protecting folks and really emphasizing that locally led development approach to development, you want to ensure that your other policies, your other policy instruments, whether it's foreign policy, security policy, trade policy, also align with those policies, right? So there's no tension. For example, in terms of security cooperation, many people have named the fact that Canada procures arms to certain countries that have a history of human rights violation as contradictory to its FIAP policy. That's one concrete example. One other example I can mention is in terms of migrant governance. Again, a feminist approach would prioritize migrants' dignity, their need to have access to safe havens, and those policies are important and they exist for a reason. But when it comes to managing the migration crisis that we're seeing a lot in the world right now, sometimes the reaction is not as conducive of respecting the FIAP and those principles. And what I'm going to focus specifically on is ODA accounting, because increasingly, yes, ODA has been shrinking, but in addition to that, many of those ODA donor countries are also spending more of their ODA funds or money or donations on in-donor refugee costs. And that means, so for those of you who don't know what in-donor refugee costs are, they are the costs that are used by the donor country to help with resettlement of refugees, for example, in the donor country. And so with that being said, that means that there is less money actually going towards addressing the structural root causes of displacement, which can be climate change, inequalities, poverty, and security, right? So you have to kind of be able to see how the feminist policy translates and also kind of trickles down to other spaces, otherwise it's not coherent. That's the first point. My second point is on the conceptual clarity. So to date, we have a feminist international assistance policy, it's true, But when we ask the question, what does that concretely mean in practice, we don't know. Right? And there's different definitions of feminism, in the world and between institutions and actors. And so sometimes it's really hard to track and measure the results of the FIAP because you don't have that conceptual clarity. That's the second point. And my final point is on the implementation aspect of things. Again, the gaps are very much in part informed by this lack of conceptual clarity, but also the lack of funding. So a feminist approach would, again, prioritize long-term, flexible access to funding that enables organizations to be able to implement their programs and projects over the long term. Because when it's short term, you have, let's say, I don't know, $5 million for a project for 4 years. What happens after the 4 years? So the predictability of funding is important. The long term, the flexibility of funding is also important. And Canada and many other countries, I would say that, the development system are really focused on short-term, risk-adverse, and fragmented ways of, giving funds to organizations. So that's my answer, my very long answer to your second question.
Thank you so much for those responses. The next question is for Lisa. Can you please describe a sample past project supported by the Joint SDG Fund that represents the fund's relevant contribution to advance the 2030 agenda? Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is an ongoing project. We try not to work in projects anymore for exactly the example Andy gave. Projects have a beginning and an end, and if you're not careful, you go back a year later, you scratch, and you can't find evidence of it. So the whole idea, really, of sustainable development is Lego blocks that are interlocking and are building up the ecosystem of development for a country, right? That are transformative, that begin to change hearts and minds and begin to change culture and belief systems, right? And all the things that go along with those, right? Women's empowerment, youth empowerment, better access to healthcare and services for all, et cetera. So in Zimbabwe, a country that is a least developed country, a country that is under political sanctions from numerous of the tall trees that we may have heard about from Dr. Songwe. The United Nations paired together with a regional bank called Old Mutual to activate investments into solar power, into renewables. And this hadn't been done before. We structured a separate fund under the legislation of the government, and we basically, as the UN, with precious public money that comes from governments that donate to this fund, right, that grant money into the UN fund, we de-risked for the first $10 million. And by doing that, a regional bank out of South Africa matched us 2 to 1. So now again, for every dollar into those solar panels, I'm getting $2 more from a private bank. And now I can say to others that I'm up to $3 and I can start to grow this fund. So that's an example of how now hospitals, clinics, schools in rural Zimbabwe now have, access to the grid because we've helped them install those panels, all installed by women-led and youth-led enterprises. And that's a little example of a catalytic investment vehicle. What's exciting for me about this example is that the other strand of the DNA in the fund I manage is integrated policy solutions. So you say to yourself, well, gosh, Lisa, your 10 million is already 30, and your goal was 100. How are you going to get from 30 million to 100? Well, I've got to get to deeper pockets. I have to go beyond Old Mutual. I have to go to all their clients. Turns out the clients of Old Mutual are pension funds. And how do I get pension funds to invest? Well, it really helps if there's a legislative incentive. So because the UN works hand in hand with governments and on their policy stream, knows parliamentarians, knows ministers, knows cabinet level people, the equivalents of Tom and Andy here on the Canadian side, right? These are the folks that are helping guide your government policies and legislation on the development side, but still, that's the kind of ecosystem. We realize that a prescribed asset class, a special label that could go onto our project, onto our solar panels, could open the door to pension funds of every civil servant in Zimbabwe. So imagine if I had access to Tom and Andy's pension, which is a generous one because they're loyal civil servants of the government of Canada. Now I'm doing that in Zimbabwe, so Zimbabwean civil servants can invest in those solar panels in their own country, in rural areas. That gets me up now to 100 million. Now, if we could start replicating that in other developing countries, if we could work in those two sides, we start to unlock money that goes a lot further than the 10 million I started with. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm so glad you chose that example among so many extraordinary projects of the UN Joint SDG Fund. That is indeed one of my favorites as well. Listen, before I move on into, we move on into the last couple of questions, I just want to remind you that the panelists are going to be staying in the reception, so please do feel free to reach out with any additional questions you might have, not only to learn more from them, as I did, and have been privileged to have the opportunity to learn from them in the past, but also to, maybe get even more inspired about the organizations they represent here. Myself, I've been also privileged to be inspired by the organizations they represent, both in relation to my advocacy and academic activities at McGill, but also in relation to my consulting activities. So please do reach out, and have a chat with them, both to learn and also to be hopefully inspired from their work. Listen, Tom, I'd love to get back to you with one more question directed to you, which is the following. How do you navigate political priorities in Ottawa while maintaining long-term development commitments abroad?
Wow. So, my real title in the Government of Canada is Loyal Public Servant. And luckily, we live in Canada, where my minister, the Prime Minister, are democratically elected. And so we provide, and I used to work for the former president of the Treasury Board, also a minister, and he happened to have been a close confidant of Jean Chrétien. He told me one thing. In order to be a good public servant, and believe it or not, the most powerful and the most loyal public servant is actually the clerk of the Privy Council. So he's still a servant. So we're all public servants. What does that mean? We have to listen to what our government would like us to do. And under Prime Minister Carney, he was very clear. He was elected on the platform, and then he issued the 7 missions, and all of us public servants, let us say, read every single word, and try to make sure that we align with it. And there's nothing that, for example, Dr. Vera Songwe said that is misaligned with that at all. And in addition to that, the 7 missions and the emphasis on economic diplomacy, economic relations, economic partnerships, I could sit down with the deputy minister, whatever deputy minister of Vietnam, and we can have a good conversation, because that was what they asked of us, like a decade ago. And in 2010, at the annual general meeting of the African Development Bank in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, there was a little innocent plaque at the entrance into the annual meeting. Africa wants business. And it's interesting that, when people think about political priorities or shift and so on and so forth, that it is necessarily bad. Every year it changes based on changing landscape, based on improvements in human knowledge and know-how. And so my bottom line is that, for example, 10 years ago, I was on this crazy crusade to build the new school of blended finance. Everybody thought I was a nut job. But now you got Joint SDG Fund. And all I can say is that, this is about the future of international development, and who creates the future of international development except you folks. And so think about what you will create. Are you going to listen to the rhythms of human society and the economic trends and so on and so forth, and create the new solutions for people and for planet? And how do we strengthen partnership? So that's actually how I navigate, is to remind myself of that 4 words that my former boss, the Honorable Marcel Massé, former president of the Treasury Board, told me. As a public servant, I have to provide good input so that the ministers can provide good output. Giggle. And thankfully, our Prime Minister gave me the 7 missions, and I know how to actually, articulate those 7 missions in my own portfolio, because he's not going to tell me how to do my job as a public servant. And then it is up to me to provide good input within the space of development partnerships in order to actually strengthen, for example, trade and investment relationship between Vietnam and Canada, or Canada and Indonesia, or wherever I happen to be accountable for.
Thank you, Tom. Excellent answer. Thank you for that, indeed. Oh, well. So we have a last question here to follow for Andy. Considering the relevant number of organizations that work toward similar goals but operate in parallel, what role could strategic partnerships or new forms of institutional collaboration play in strengthening collective impact, particularly considering the current circumstances?
Thank you, Christian. Again, a big question on the future of development, and maybe the present of development, actually. What I will say is that, of course, the world in which we used to operate in silos, in our own corners, in our own echo chambers, is no longer the same world today. And as Vera mentioned earlier, she mentioned the idea of parallel highways. That's what I'm going to use to describe the current system. You have very specific organizations, institutions that focus on a specific need, a specific objective, a specific mandate. And in times where we are facing pressures of financial resources, for example, there's no more funding in the sector. We know that. ODA cuts are shrinking significantly. We're also seeing a lot of demand on the operational side. The needs are greater than they were before. And we're facing this issue of people and governments and donors alike wanting more in terms of the return of investment. So Lisa mentions that, for example, for every $1, she's able to leverage or get back $19 out of it. And we're being asked consistently to make the business case for international development. And so this moment requires that we find strategic ways to collaborate, to eliminate duplication between and across sectors and issue areas. And that could come in the form of mergers. We've seen recently, I read a report from the UN Women and UNFPA merger idea. They were analyzing whether it was a good idea to merge the two agencies into one because of potential duplication of mandates, and also the cost of the competition for funding, but also the impact on communities at the end of the day. So I feel like, yes, we have options for mergers, but we also have different options, including partial integrations, for example. Cooperation Canada just recently led a project that we called SPIAs. It's called Strategic Partnerships, Integrations, and Amalgamations. And the purpose of that project was to see if we were able to provide some sort of space for our members, which are CSOs that work in global cooperation and development as well, the opportunity to come together and gauge partnerships, whether it's full-blown mergers or partial integrations or just very significant types of partnerships that go beyond the coalitions, the advocacy spaces that we already have. And so, yes, the future of international development is going to be defined or determined by you guys, but I think that organizations also have this duty to find ways to eliminate the duplication and to use the funds much better. So that's what I will say in terms of that.
Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
And the last question we have is actually directed at all three of the panelists. What advice would you give students entering international development who want to work at the intersection of policy, finance, and multilateral institutions? How can students at the undergraduate level begin building a career to work in places like the ones you work?
Well, Christian said Tom. So, even though most of my colleagues at Global Affairs Canada always tell me, you got a CFA charter, wow, and you could have done investment banking. I'm like, okay. My question to you is this. You entered the world of international development. Why? Is it because you care about people? Because you're curious about people? You want to contribute to the well-being of people and planet? If that is your calling, then my question to you is this. Are you going to invest in getting to know people? Because that, believe it or not, was one of the greatest decisions I made early on, when I was just 13, right out of a refugee camp. I asked a lot of questions. I'm like, why me at 11 years old, staying 2 years in a refugee camp? What did I do wrong? And from that on, I try to understand the world as much as I can. And I learned everything. What a lot of people don't know is that I actually am a liberal arts person. Even though I have an economics degree, I have a business degree, I'm a CFA charter holder, and I'm well known in the world as a blended finance engineer, structuring person, and I built startups. But in order to work at the intersection of policy, finance, and multilateral institutions, frankly, those are just jobs. Policy is about the art of, pardon the term, bullshitting. So if you know how to tell a good story, how to stitch together to connect with people, talk to the folks in marketing, talk to the psychologists who actually learn how to listen extremely well, and then give it back. That's actually the art of policymaking. And then when it comes to finance, multilateral institutions, they're actually the same thing. Like I sat on the board of the World Bank Group. My specialty was the International Finance Corporation. We do hydroelectric dams, oil, gas, mining stuff, and so on and so forth. So investments. My question is this. Do you really, really, really need, say, a business degree to actually do investments? Some people say yes, but I have a business degree. I sort of like disagree with that. What you need is actually curiosity, and you also need a little bit of, a smattering of knowledge and know-how. For example, if you don't know balance sheets, you may not be able to do what she does. And then if you don't know how to gamble, then you don't know probability, and so on and so forth. Like, for example, PhD level finance, I was studying under the director of research of Wells Fargo's bank. And he taught us Monte Carlo sampling. And that's actually my master's research paper. I used Monte Carlo sampling in order to build a model. It was fun. And one of the greatest model in high finance is what we call the random walk. Imagine you are totally drunk walking down Sherbrooke. How do you think you're going to be able to walk? Straight line? The answer is no. That's actually the model that best captures the behavior of prices, say stocks and whatever it is. So it's really, really weird, some of the stuff that you learn, but the way that you think about entering this world is curiosity, people, and get to know a lot of different things. And then always ask questions, get to know people. There are no stupid questions. I know that you hear about that all the time. And also, I was joking around with my friend there that the women leaders of Vietnam gave me an honorary PhD. Honorary PhD of begging. And begging is not, with a bowl handing for money. It's about how to talk to people. If you need something, why don't you ask? And if you ask and they give, you owe them one. Next time they ask you, you should give. And that actually gives you a relationship. And that's actually how I built my startup, Convergence Blended Finance Incorporated in Toronto, is because I begged, they begged, and then we became lifelong friends. One of my lifelong friends is actually, right now, well, he's retired and taking care of grandkids, but he was the founder of Sorona Asset Management Company, private equity firm based out of Kitchener-Waterloo. So that's what I mean by being curious, learn about people, you know, keep relationships warm and fuzzy, and always have fun.
Sure, I can go next. So I will say that the most important thing that perhaps you need to keep in mind is, again, it's a job, like Tom mentioned, but your why, the values that drive the why you actually want to join the sector is important to keep in mind, because there will be many, many times where you want to reconsider your choice, and I have been in that seat many, many times. I'm not kidding you. But really going back to why am I here? Why does my presence in this position, in this organization matter? What's the impact of my work? What's the value of my work? What's the value out of my presence in this world is important. I would also pass advice that I actually have gotten from people when I was entering the sector, and it was that you have to be really flexible and approach things with humility. You won't know everything coming out of university. Like, you will not, it's impossible. And oftentimes, it's also a faulty, or I would say flawed approach to how we teach in schools and universities. We focus so much on the theory and not the practical side of things. And so I found myself in my first job having to question if that was the kind of work I was supposed to do, because it did not look like what I was taught in my classes. So perhaps entering the system a bit earlier on in your career, in your university years, through internships, through co-op opportunities, through research opportunities, volunteer with your local NGOs if you can, if you have the time to do so. Interact with people in the sector. Don't be fearful of reaching out to someone on LinkedIn to ask for a cold chat. Like, that works till this day, works. I have done that many times. Tom is volunteering here for you, so you can also reach out to me if you want. I'm open. I can have a coffee, a chat, whatever you want. But ask the questions that you think will help you understand where you want to be in the sector. And don't stay stuck on that, because flexibility will take you far. And I have heard people who say, I don't want to work in anything but policy. But policy work, as Tom mentioned, is also derived from being able to be a good comms person. So perhaps you enter as a comms officer or something that is similar that then gets you to where you want to be in the future. But don't neglect that flexibility and that humility that you will require in the sector. That's my answer.
Such a great question, and it's so difficult to answer with all these talented minds in the room, including Matteo, who came very late with Brooke, but welcome, Matteo. My son's bestie from high school, who happens to go to McGill. He's the one in the back row. He's hiding.
You embarrassed him.
I'm sorry. Had to. It was too easy. So my 18-year-old complains to me all the time because we bullied him into being an engineering major, and he says, I don't even know what engineers do. And so I always try to counsel him to say, well, then you got to go and find out and talk to one or two or 10, and then you have to try to follow them around in some way to see what work is like. So you might think you're interested in writing policy until you're inside an office where all we do all day is argue about the phrase that might go into paragraph 4, subsection 3, part C. Maybe that won't be you. So I think the definitely interning, that's what got me into the UN. I was so keen. It bit me like a virus. I was taken by what I saw and what I understood. But for many of my interns, they say, thank you so much. I will never work here again. So you really do have to make sure you test the waters and be careful of getting so narrowly focused, right? Because your opportunities are so vast right now. And even if you didn't go into policymaking now, even if you did go into a CFA or an account, that doesn't mean you can't pivot later, because guess what? Guess what we need inside these grandiose institutions? We need the expertise that's on the outside. So the walls have come down, I think, of the pathways that used to be, you are public sector, you are private sector. They're blending more, just like I was giving the example. Financing means I'm trying to work with bankers, and I'm trying to learn every day how to speak banker, right? And they want to understand development. So in that regard, the doors, I think, are opening wide. I think you should be shamelessly promoters of yourself. Talk about marketing. You are your best marketer. There's no time for modesty when you're going out into the world and presenting yourself and asking for that 10-minute call on LinkedIn. And you go with it as if it's a cover letter for the job of your life, because it could be, right? So there's got to be a certain, right, go up and get it and reach for it, and then you network like nothing. And this community, this room right now, is one of your strongest sources of future jobs. The people you know in university, the professors of practice who want to help you succeed, are all already part of your network. Then you've got the family, then you've got the friends of the family, right? So you just start working out from there, but don't be modest. And then focus on your craft, because as much as you're networked, if you can't write a proper email, if you don't know how to write a thank you note, if you actually can't put together a 2-pager that describes something that your new internship boss asked for, you're not going to get the letter of recommendation that you need, right? So the craft, the core skills that McGill undoubtedly is giving and offering to you, take them, put your name on it, publish. I don't care if it's on LinkedIn. It doesn't have to be a paper in a research publication. We're all able to self-publish now, aren't we? Do it on what you believe in, on what you care about, of what upsets you, about what what motivates you, because that becomes your brand. That's your marketing of yourself. And then, over time, if you're diligent about it, if you post every month on something that matters to you, at the end of the year, you've got a little bit of a portfolio. And guess what people do when they're hiring interns? Inevitably, someone gives me their LinkedIn. Inevitably. Because who chooses my interns? My current interns. Who's doing it for me, right? We don't have time to do that. So we say to the intern, hey, help me pick the next interns. And what do? Oh, okay. Do they show any interest in the UN, or did they just come up through, a friend of the family, right? So I think there is still, of course, nepotism, all those things. But I'm a plumber's kid from Buffalo. So let me tell you, listen to Tom's story. But even a plumber's daughter from Buffalo can run a fund at the UN. So I do think there is something about rising from where you are and really believing in what you want. And McGill is a great brand already, so you've already arrived. You've already arrived. So now where do you want to go? And I also take calls. I take random requests off LinkedIn all the time, because that was me. That was me saying, oh my, the UN, So I do think don't be shy, and there's a lot of people who want to support you, especially when you say you want to help other people. Don't forget, if you do want to work in international development, it means you're probably willing to work for not that much money, comparatively speaking, right? Comparatively speaking, and you're willing to take jobs in places where maybe not everybody will go, right? So the other final point, maybe, if we're out of time, is to say, because we're such a global village now, if you have an opportunity to get some funding, to go volunteer in a developing country, to go work, of course, the local NGO, but if you could find a way to get financed, to go work in an NGO around the world in an area that you're passionate about, that really jumps out to me. Because it's one thing to say you're interested, and it's another one and by the way, you can volunteer now virtually for places. So if you don't have the opportunity to go to Vietnam or to the Philippines, et cetera, you could possibly help that NGO with something that they're working on right from your dorm room. So I think there is a lot of opportunity now to sort of bloom where you're planted, but to be sending seeds globally. Thanks.
Oh well, that was excellent, from the panelists, and particularly the inspiring comments in the last question. Jan, I don't know if you want to wrap up, or if. Yeah, so if you don't mind, we have a couple of minutes, so that's great, So as I said, Gabriela, she gathered, most of the questions that were asked, today. But, we do have time for one, maybe two questions before Jan wraps up. We have the microphone here on your right.
Don't be shy.
Certainly.
They bite, I don't know. I do not, so.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for this inspiring discussion. I will use the opportunity, not for a question, but to say to everyone that we have a Global Health Scholar program where you can apply for different options to go and to explore what you would like to explore around the world. And there are options for internships and for travel fundings. So please don't be shy. School of Population and Global Health Scholar Program is existing. And something that we are cooking currently at McGill. It's an Institute for Transforming Healthcare. It will be a hub for many options for internships, fellowships. So if you are thinking of applying for something related to a healthcare or a global healthcare, please stay tuned. It will be announced on April 1st, and it will not be an April Fool joke. So thank you.
Thank you.
There you go. Can I apply? Can I share one thing?
Oh, please go ahead.
I've been dying to, share with you one thing to hopefully help you see both the North Star and the Southern Cross. There are actually two. When I think about the world of development, I think about 5 different buckets of capital. I don't talk about money, capital. So my wonderful colleague Andy talks about ODA a lot. That's one of my bucket only. The other bucket is the IFIs. They are banks. They're not ODA, they're banks. They build stuff, like they invest in roads, in ports and so on and so forth, in transmission grids, you name it. The other one, just about, I think, 20-minute walk from here or so, FinDev Canada, Development Finance Institutions, and the International Finance Corporation is also a DFI, and Trump has his Development Finance Corp, DFC. They are not ODA. They have a different characteristic. That's the third. The fourth one is, if you know how to deploy it, non-financial capital. What does that mean? One time, the Trade Association of Vietnam asked me do I have a friend who happens to be the former CEO of JWT Canada? I said, yes, Tony Piggott. You want him? They did, and they paid for his plane ticket to go to Hanoi for a one-day conference, their annual ritual, to share his expertise on how to brand and market their rice and other products so that the discount that their products have relative to the Thai is gone. Cost me nothing, cost them $15,000, non-financial capital. The fifth one, thanks to what Vera Songway talked about, is now I learn and use every single bucket of capital from Industry Canada, from Ag Canada, from immigration, doesn't matter which one, that's usually non-ODA. But if your partners want our expertise, why do I need to create a project for that when I have access to the entire government? And if the Canadian government doesn't have it, I call our friends in the Quebec government, and I have friends in the Ontario government as well. And actually, some of us collaborate in order to provide, for example, infrastructure advice to the government of Indonesia. That was like 2019. So think about that in terms of mapping out your future for development partnership, 5 different buckets. ODA is just one.
Thank you, Tom. Were you going to ask a question? Sorry. Were you? Yeah.
Can you hear me on the side?
You can.
So I know the talk itself talked about security and re-globalization. I'm wondering, again, I know we're getting close to the end here, but how would you see if certain countries are retrenching into that security paradigm? Like, how are you kind of leveraging that security model and frame in the context of development? I'm wondering nowadays how you engage with that model. I know Dr. Songwei started that conversation. I'm wondering in your fields specifically, how you've been working with the security model. Thank you.
I'll start. So we've been hearing a lot from the government about we need to pay more attention to trade and security and development. So the dev trade, the security nexus. And so one of the things that the case that we've been making is that for you to be able to have stable economies to trade with in the future, you have to invest in their stability today. So that means investing in their development today, right? So that's the approach that we have taken in advocacy to be able to convey the importance of investing in economic stability, development for long-term partnerships down the line. So that's just one example I will share with you. Yeah, we're still kind of wrapping our head around this whole conversation. It's new, but that's one of the areas that we are looking into.
If you promise not to quote me, I'll share with you 3 very concrete things. So Dr. Vera Songwei talked about new trade friendships, partnerships, and so on and so forth. Some of our partners need our help to know how to negotiate on an even footing with us, to figure out how to benefit from those trade and investment agreements. That's where ODA can come in. We can deploy some Canadian experts to help them negotiate against us. Just kidding. In an agreement, there has to be win-win. And we have done that. The other thing is when Dr. Songwei talked about the G7 action plan for critical minerals, it's actually done by my colleague and friend, the Director General in charge of economic growth, who happens to be a development professional. And, it is a marriage of both trade and development. And the path, if you have taken a course in the international development economic history of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and so on and so forth, they were dirt poor. How did they get themselves out of it and become, world class today? Trade and investment. It was mostly export-led growth and heavy industries plans and industrial policies and stuff like that with some sort of like blended finance in a way. But I happen to study under the one of the advisors to the Economic Planning Board to President Park Chung-hee of South Korea. And he told us everything in terms of how to think about that. So everything that Dr. Songwei talked about is something that I would say could be considered to be a window of opportunity in order to create new prosperous partnerships. But you just need to know who your partners are, what they need and what you need, and what could be a mutually beneficial deal and the kind of result that you want. And if they need something that you have, give it to them, because they will give something back in return. And I will tell you one little story, but please also, it was done in a car by a friend of mine who happens to right now be the chief advisor on Vietnam-China relations. He's Vietnamese. And we talked about how to strengthen Canada-Vietnam relations trade since our conversation in 2017, especially in the agri-food sector, has skyrocketed. And how did we do that? It was a piece of paper, might as well be called a marriage contract. Canada, Vietnam, thanks to Prime Minister Trudeau and his counterpart, they signed a paper that elevated the relationship. You can call it, friend to marriage partner. That's how I call it, even though the word is like from strategic to comprehensive. I didn't understand those big words. And I told him, I don't understand what you're talking about. He said, with this piece of paper, if your prime minister signs it, every single request that you get, you will not be the 10th most important partner. You'll be number 4. And I was like, oh. And it was 2 pages, and if you see on the websites and you Google, big words, but the practical applications of it is that it was a license to work together on many different fronts. So do think about those kinds of issues when you try to decipher what Dr. Vera Sangwe said into concrete applications going forward. And I see it as a golden opportunity for Canada and for Canadians to reduce our dependency on our southern neighbor, for your grandchildren, for my great-grandchildren.
So I'm a little bit different because I rely on interested parties who focus on development to work through the mechanisms that I offer on behalf of the UN. So when a government, a Scandinavian government, switches their foreign policy away from development and towards the security sector because of their fear of an invasion from Russia, what happens is the envelope that they had previously committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, to women's empowerment, to healthcare systems, to et cetera, it shrinks. And of course, it has to go into defense. So on my side, when I see the broad scope of what's happening because of Russia's invasion, but also now in the Middle East, the problem is it's a huge political distraction. It's a necessary, I understand the necessity of it, but it takes us away and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars, right? You look at all the cancellations of hotels across the Middle East, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, which is jobs, which is income, which is down to those people that are working in those hotels and driving those Ubers and all that. So for me, it's a bit different. It's trying to, a little bit like Andy was saying, you're trying to make the case for development in the midst of a very, very shortened and small budget envelope, and it's very difficult. So then you ask yourself, well, then how do we avoid conflict? Well, then you argue for multilateralism. You argue that partnerships and conversation are better than the opposite, and I am the neighbor to the south, and I still can't get over the relationship that is evolving because of leadership of the US right now. It's surreal to me. I grew up across the Niagara Falls border. I mean, you're my cousins, basically. We're basically cousins. So wait, what are we talking about here? But that's where we are. So it is a very dire time to try to, again, I love the North Star Southern Cross. Like, how do you keep your eye on your values and your belief systems when there's so much chaos? And it's very distracting. It's very chaotic. Inside the UN, there's a risk of us getting distracted. So the goal is to just keep on course, nerves of steel, and keep delivering impact that no one can refute. 1 to 19 is very hard to argue. No one else in the UN can give you that. I can. So I keep repeating it. But that's marketing, right? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Jan, I'll invite you to maybe thank our panelists and wrap up.
All right, so this was fantastic. I thought it was very eloquent from all of you and inspiring. I hope you all feel very inspired as well. So I want to just give a big round of applause to all of